Well, I'm going to get started. Welcome to the official welcome and keynote address of the 5th annual conference of the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy, Governing Territorial Food Systems, Legal Obstacles and Opportunities. My name is Stephen Wood. I'm the director of the Centre for Law and the Environment at the Allard School of Law in the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, which has the honor of hosting this conference. Although we're meeting virtually, this is the first time that the conference has been hosted in Western Canada, and we are proud to have the privilege of being your virtual hosts. The conference began already this morning with a panel on Indigenous territorialities and food system governance. It was followed by a panel on updates in Canadian food law and policy, and we're now going to listen to a welcome from the Dean of the Peter A. Allard School of Law, Professor Janine Benedett, and a keynote address by Haida lawyer Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson. I am an uninvited guest on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. The Centre for Law and the Environment and the Law School itself are located on Musqueam territory, and all of you, the participants in this virtual gathering, may be joining us from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of various Indigenous nations. I'd invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous owners and stewards of the places you find ourselves. In fact, I am going to invite everyone who's joining us now to use the chat to tell us who you are, whose territory you're on, and what work you're doing there briefly. And as you're doing that, and I look forward to seeing those pop up as I speak, I would like to note that a representative of the Musqueam Nation was not available to join us today to welcome us officially onto Musqueam territory. But if they were here and we were asking them to welcome us to gather on their territory, what would we say to them? Why are we gathering here? What do we have in our hearts? What do we have in our minds? What work do we intend to do together? And I would say that we're here to work together towards achieving sustainable food systems, towards respecting Indigenous food sovereignty, understanding the impacts of COVID-19 on food systems, confronting the climate crisis, ensuring food security, and addressing other challenges and opportunities facing food systems. Some of this work is sobering and daunting. Some of it's hopeful, some of it is even fun. A lot of it is hard, and all of it is rewarding. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Dean Benedett to welcome us and introduce Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson. After Terri-Lynn's keynote, I will moderate a Q&A session with the audience. And I just want to say a word about the logistics of that. When the time comes for Q&A, or even before that, if you think of a question as things are proceeding, I would like you to please type your questions into the Q&A bubble. You'll see in your Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen, one of the choices is Q&A. We'd like you to do that rather than putting questions into the chat, because it's much easier to follow and manage the questions in the Q&A, and the audience can have fun by upvoting questions that they like, and those will get our attention more quickly. This session and the conference as a whole are being recorded, and the recordings will be available for viewing on the conference website, which you can find at foodlaw.ca. And with that, I will ask Dean Benedett to welcome us on behalf of the law school and introduce Terri-Lynn. Janine.
Thank you so much, Professor Wood. As Professor Wood has said, my name is Janine Benedett, and I have the pleasure of serving this year as Dean of the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Today, I'm not on campus. It's not one of my approved days to be in the building. So I'm speaking to you from my home in North Vancouver, also located on the territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. I want to thank, first of all, the organizers of this wonderful event, the 5th conference of the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy. My colleague, Professor Stephen Wood, graduating Allard Law JD student Victoria Bayless, and Nadia Lambeck from the University of Toronto, although soon to be from Western University's Law School, as I've just learned, as well as all of the event planning and IT staff necessary to make an event like this happen. And while I am very sorry that we are not able to welcome you to beautiful Allard Hall in Vancouver, I do appreciate the ways in which online platforms have allowed us this year to come together from near and far to exchange ideas and raise each other's awareness about the ways in which law and policy affect the ecosystems that produce the food that keeps us all alive. So this is very important work that you are undertaking, and we're really delighted to be the hosts for this event and to give you a forum both to exchange ideas and to amplify those ideas to a larger audience. So welcome. And I now have the very great honor of introducing your keynote speaker this afternoon, Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson, who is speaking to us today on the topic of supernatural oceans, a worldview for enlightened oceans governance and territorial food systems. Terri-Lynn will speak about the importance of oceans to the Haida and other coastal indigenous peoples, drawing upon ancient Haida narratives, the Haida worldview, and Haida art traditions. She will propose a conception of territorial food systems and discuss the opportunities and challenges of the Haida Gwaii experience. And I can think of no better person to convey all of that to us. Terri-Lynn, as many of you will know, is a citizen of and general counsel to the Haida Nation. She has practiced law in the area of indigenous environmental law since 1995 and is currently pursuing an LLM degree here at the Allard School of Law. Since 1995, she's represented the Haida Nation at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada, in litigation to protect the old growth forests of Haida Gwaii, including in a case which is the leading case on consultation and accommodation of Indigenous rights. She is counsel for the Haida Nation's Aboriginal title case, the related reconciliation negotiations, which have resulted in innovative agreements with British Columbia and Canada, as well as other environmentally focused litigation, such as successfully challenging the Enbridge Northern Gateway project and securing injunctive relief for protection of herring stocks. Terri-Lynn is an honorary director of Eco-Justice, a member of the Law Society of BC's Truth and Reconciliation Advisory Committee, and an affiliated research scholar with the Canada Climate Law Initiative, which is also headquartered here at the Allard School of Law. She's a recipient of too many honors for me to name without taking up all of her speaking time, but I will note that she was awarded the Andrew Thompson Award for lifetime contributions to environmental protection and sustainability, a Courage in Law Award from our very own Indigenous Law Students Association, and most recently, in 2021, she was part of Maclean's Power List, recognizing 50 Canadians who are breaking ground in their field. And somehow, in addition to all of that, she finds time to be a multi-award-winning performer, artist, dancer, and author. And you can find out more at her website, which is ravencallingproductions.ca. We can probably put that in the chat. So please join me in welcoming Terri-Lynn to give us her keynote address.
Singeitla, Gidahl-Guudsdllyaay hanuti khiaga, tika gels khiaga, huyet dikuringe la Guudsdllyaay. Thank you everyone for that very kind introduction, Dean Benedict, and also for the opportunity to speak today on this very important topic. I come to you from the beautiful and green territory of the Semiahmoo Nation right at the edge of Canada. And I'm presenting to you today using a case study of another edge of Canada, Haida Gwaii. So I'm just going to share my screen. And you can see me fumble around to get this going. All right, so this is what I'll speak about today, are the importance of oceans from the Haida perspective, the Haida conception of oceans and Haida laws, enlightened oceans governance and territorial food systems, and the Haida territorial food system. My research at Allard has focused on supernatural beings, hence the topic of this presentation. It is an area of law that is omitted from the dominant method of Indigenous laws research in Canada. Usually supernatural knowledge is bracketed and not discussed, and I think it's important to be included and recognized in an examination of Indigenous laws, and today in the examination of food systems. So this is my favorite image of Haida Gwaii. It's Haida Gwaii from space. It's these beautiful shining islands as seen from the space shuttle, just south of Alaska and north of Vancouver Island and on the western edge of Canada. I would like to take you on a journey to the edge of the world and back and share some images of Haida Gwaii, not a typical PowerPoint with text, but I'm hoping to engage you in looking at this place and the importance of that place to arriving at food systems, territorial food systems. Haida Gwaii endures the most energetic waves climate in North America. It is located in a transition zone of ocean currents that carry nutrient and plankton-rich surface water. And because of that, it contains some of the richest marine environments on the planet. There are highly diverse nearshore and shoreline areas that provide important habitat for marine species and birds. There's a picture here of rose spit, which is has been recognized as a globally significant bird area in the world. It projects into the ocean realm and weathers the power of 2 circulation gyres. The power is visceral if you've ever had the opportunity to go there, feeling the forces from both sides. The Haida have protected 72% of these shorelines, which is quite significant given that we have not yet signed any treaty or comprehensive agreement, and we've not yet concluded our title litigation. It is intertidal zones are an indicator of the health of the oceans, and so it was really important for us to pay attention to those shorelines in the work that we've done in our interim reconciliation agreements. Even though these areas are so important, they're also highly threatened. Several species in the Northeast Pacific range from fully exploited to overexploited. Haida Gwaii contains 2 of the top 10 commercial fishing grounds in British Columbia and is a significant state of other fisheries. Marine spaces are increasingly critical to the survival of all marine species, the economy, and humanity's existence. Globally, over 90% of the world's marine fish stocks are fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. Other human activities, including the exploitation of hydrocarbons, further degrade ocean health. And in addition, pathogenic marine bacteria impact food safety here in British Columbia and globally. So these oceans are very important to Haida people. This is a diagram showing the Haida seasonal round. As an archipelago without a significant source of terrestrial game, our year-round source of protein comes from the oceans. We harvest about 150 marine species throughout Haida Gwaii in every month of the year. I came across this phrase from the elders last week, and I thought it was so beautiful. Our food is our medicine. So everything we need for our internal health, our physical or spiritual health comes from the oceans. So the Haida have done a lot of work in looking at traditional use of oceans, and the outcome of a long traditional use study was a map called Oceans and Way of Life. And it is different from most traditional use studies in that it is comprehensive and holistic. It looks at historic harvesting, current locations, historic locations of harvesting, and systems and practices, as well as the supernatural beings that are embodied around those food systems. As you can see from this detail of the southern part of Haida Gwaii, oceans are ever present in daily life. You will find the ocean. The furthest space from you and the ocean is 20 kilometers from Haida Gwaii. So it's that pervasiveness and the power of the ocean has created a culture of abundance. Now, in other Indigenous peoples, found convergence with some beings. And for Haida people, we have convergence with the Orcas. So this Haida Gwaii has been determined to be critical habitat for the northern resident Orcas. We share the same clan system. They're either eagle or raven. They have towns that are above our towns. And so that is what I mean by convergence. The Haida word for orca is the same word, root word that is in the word supernatural beings, Rana. In fact, the primary form of supernatural beings when they appear in the human realm is as an orca. In the Haida worldview, every species is a people in and of their own right. And so the salmon people, we would call China Haida salmon people. We don't just call them salmon. We don't see them as inanimate beings or species. They have a spirit when they return to the rivers. Salmon have lived, of course, in the Pacific Northwest for at least 7 million years. They have nourished the forest ecosystems. There's great work by people like Tom Reinken who's looked at the carcasses of salmon that bears bring into the forest and nourish and allow us to create these beautiful old growth forests that we're so blessed to live in here in Vancouver and in the Coast Salish territory. An elder has said that salmon are creatures of the forest because they're born there and they die there. In Haida Gwaii, all 7 species of salmon are present, and they have nourished Haida peoples physically, spiritually, and culturally, and they have a high profile in Haida narratives. So that means that we've gone through the ancient narratives that were recorded at contact, and many, many times salmon occur. Nancy Turner has said that then is a keystone cultural species. So salmon is one of those keystone cultural species. There are all of the laws that govern fishing for salmon are performance-based. We have to engage in certain ceremonies to take salmon from the river. We have to cut the salmon a certain way. And in addition, the actual act of cutting and working with salmon, preserving it, is an opportunity for the youth to learn not only the laws associated with salmon, but the general laws about the Haida worldview, about Haida Gwaii, and the importance of our relationship with the salmon. In this photo is a net in Copper Bay. It's the place that I traditionally fished when I grew up in Haida Gwaii. And then in the lower right-hand side is a fish weir, one of the oldest fishing weirs in Haida Gwaii. It's actually the river that Tom Reinken also did his research in Haida Gwaii. As a further example of the connection time that youth have with their families is harvesting for sea urchin in the Guayhanas area. It's a family event. You do it at low tide in places like Guayhanas. These sea urchins are highly treasured by elders. In my mother's last days, she said to me that if she could just have one more sea urchin, then she could die. And I really wanted to meet her request, but I also didn't want to because I wanted her to stay with me. But there are many other foods that are so highly treasured by elders, like the sea urchin, and also like herring spawn and kelp. So the herring people are called Inang Haidare, and they produce herring spawn and kelp. So this picture of Elder Diane Brown in her youth, harvesting and putting away herring spawn and kelp and hanging it to dry in the village of Skidegate. This is an important fishery, a really important fishery to elders like Diane Brown. She provided evidence and testimony in a case that we brought in 2015 before the federal court. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans was contemplating opening that fishery. DFO scientists recommended against reopening the fishery in 2014, yet the minister opened the fishery anyway. The fishery was about to proceed and we were posed to go to court to seek an injunction, but the Haida reached an agreement to not fish with the commercial fishermen who fished on Haida Gwaii. In 2015, we had a benefit of a year to assess herring stocks. The herring didn't go up, they went even further down, and yet the minister opened the fishery again. The evidence showed that the stocks were weaker. The The Haida have long recognized the importance of the herring fishery and the depletion of it and have not fished for many, many years. The commercial roe herring fishery has been closed since 2003 and the spawn on kelp fishery since 2005. We sought an injunction on the basis that the herring had not sufficiently recovered, that DFO had failed to consult and accommodate, relying upon the Haida case that was mentioned earlier, that DFO had failed to develop a management framework with appropriate strategies for rebuilding the herring stocks in Haida Gwaii, and that that absence of creating that plan was contrary to the honor of the Crown in the spirit of and intent of the various joint management agreements on Haida Gwaii. Our evidence was supported by evidence from Parks Canada. Part of the fishery was contemplated to be opened in the Gwy area, which is subject to the Gwy agreement that I often speak about and won't speak about here. But the Parks Canada evidence emphasized that if the fishery were to proceed against the recommendations of the management board for the Gwy area, that the reconciliation progress made over the last 30 years would be jeopardized and that the whole relationship would fail. And the court ultimately recognized the importance of those reconciliation efforts. They noted that the fish would likely decline. We don't know by how much, but that it would decline, and also acknowledged the importance of herring spawn and kelp to Haida culture, traditions, and way of life. The court noted that, in my opinion, there is a heightened duty for DFO and the minister to accommodate the Haida Nation in negotiating and determining the roe herring fishing in Haida Gwaii, given the existence of the Gwy agreement, the unique Haida Gwaii marine conservation area, the ecological concerns, and the duty to foster reconciliation with and protection of the constitutional rights of the Haida Nation. The court also found that it would constitute irreparable harm if the fishery were to proceed, given the lack of consultation and accommodation on the part of DFO. Another important species that has long since seen the same fate as herring has been northern abalone. It's been closed on the coast since 1990. It's listed as threatened. It was listed as threatened in 2000. It was once plentiful from Alaska to Baja California. It was a staple of the Haida diet, eaten like bread. I spent my summers in the Gwy area fishing for abalone at low tide, like the photograph shown earlier. Elders have told us about how important abalone were to the diet of Haida people. It is also a culturally significant species. It adorns ceremonial regalia. It adorns art objects, Haida clan. It's part of the Haida clan crest system, and it's an important part of Potlatch traditions. This is my chief, Gidahl, wearing a frontlet that my husband carved for him and gifted to him in Potlatch, and it marked his ascent to a chief of our clan in 2015. Because of all those reasons, and because it appears throughout the Haida narratives, it is also a cultural keystone species. So in the Haida worldview I've already mentioned, all of the different species are regarded as peoples in their own right. This area, the oceans, encode Haida laws, and indeed on the entire coast, encode indigenous laws in the oceans themselves. Haida people originate from the ocean, so it's a really significant area to us. We came from supernatural beings such as foam women who emerged from the Gwy area and gave birth to the Haida people who are ravens. The greatest of the supernatural beings is called Tangwan, which translates as the one in the sea. Tangwan owns all of the sablefish, or the black cod, and everything put in the ocean goes into his home. So that then requires us to be very careful about what goes into the ocean, because it affects our food and it also affects the home of Tangwan. This sacred realm requires that we uphold the laws of respect and reciprocity that are found in so many indigenous nations. We do that by making offerings of cedar bark and flicker feathers into the ocean. The narratives and our culture tell us that the oceans keep us alive spiritually. They contain knowledge and ceremonies. We actually obtained the knowledge of how to create fire from the ocean peoples who embedded fire in cedar bark. The ocean peoples gave us the cedar bark ceremonies that are the foundation of potlatches that I'll talk about later. And they also gave us the knowledge of totem poles. We saw totem poles in the undersea world and then started creating them on the land and in our human realm today. The shamans are also integrally connected with the oceans. There are many shamans who live in the undersea world and they get their power from the oceans and they draw upon that power to heal people and to keep our spirits safe and strong. The narratives also tell us that the oceans are a portal for transformation. Often fishermen and harvesters will cleanse themselves and become transformed. Often people will become transformed from a regular citizen into someone who contributes back into the community and someone of high social status through the oceans. Often it is the oceans that is part of giving retribution after someone breaks laws. So someone could go back into the ocean and be transformed and therefore understand how they broke the laws and see the path through creating a new path with the community and with the nation. The Haida worldview, which sees the oceans as another realm and our realm, has hardwired into it this notion of interconnectedness that is so important in management of natural resources and really important for food law. Elder Diane Brown teaches us that there are marine cousins to every terrestrial species that you find on the landscape. So abalone's cousin are the salmonberries, and those species go on and on like that so that we have an integral connection between each of these species from the ocean realm and the land realm. This is an image of a transformation mask that my husband created, showing a transformation from a killer whale into an eagle. And so you'll see this theme of transformation through much of indigenous art. And it's a beautiful object to look at, but there are deep roots and deeper meanings behind that transformation that we also need to pay attention to. In the Haida conception of the world, the winds are also personified as supernatural beings. This is a representation of southeast wind, which is the most powerful wind that blows on Haida Gwaii. We often face gale force winds of over 100 kilometers an hour. When the winds appear, they're often represented as orcas, such as southeast wind here is represented as a red orca. All of this view of the conception of Haida Gwaii is also embodied and contained in the Haida Law of Balance, Gidahl-Guudsdllyaay, as I'll show you next in the next image. This is an image that I've just created this week, and it is an image of our conception of Haida Gwaii. And so the narratives and the elders tell us that at the beginning of time, before humans were created, the supernatural beings had a battle for who would hold up Haida Gwaii. And the supernatural being Gwy Trust gained the privilege of holding up Haida Gwaii with a cedar pole attached to his chest. And on top of that cedar pole, Haida Gwaii balances. Every time there is an earthquake, this marten will run up and down the pole, causing it to shake and causing an earthquake on Haida Gwaii. We are located right at the convergence of fault lines, so we often have earthquakes there. In the undersea realm, the narratives tell us of journeying down into the supernatural realm and meeting with the supernatural beings who have homes like our homes, cedar longhouses and totem poles. These are the homes of the supernatural beings. They have hanging on the door their killer whale skins, and they appear as humans, and we learn ceremonies inside these longhouses in the undersea realm. When they journey to our realm, they appear as orcas. So this is the supernatural beings coming into our realm, and that is why we have such great respect for the killer whales. So this is obviously our whole conception as a people and as the islands is based on the need to always be constantly finding balance. There's a beautiful expression, the world is as sharp as the edge of a knife. It's the most famous Haida proverb there is, because we are always on that balance in that precarious state, which I think is really important for us to consider when we're looking at food law, given the many different challenges that we face in trying to find a solution through building food systems for the future. So this idea of supernatural beings is, the Haida worldview is a complete landscape and oceanscape of supernatural beings. This is an image of low tide woman. She is the caretaker of all of the shellfish and marine species that live in the intertidal zone. We have to ask permission from her before we take anything from her realm, any clams, any abalone, any octopus, whatever it is we're taking, we need to get her permission. We need to show her respect. She teaches us, like demonstrates how to show yakudang or respect. She also teaches us that the ocean realm is a feminine realm that warrants stewarding. We need to there always is someone there who must steward the resources before we take those resources into our body as food. Similarly, there is Gidahl-Guudsdllyaay Creek woman. She appears at every one of the rivers and streams in Haida Gwaii. Our streams are coke colored, but they're beautifully fresh waters. And here she is in a river, in amongst the salmon. Also, we must ask permission to seek salmon or trout from her waters before we take them. She also demonstrates and embodies the law of respect, or yakudang. So this is a very different worldview where we're really conscious of everything that we take into our body. We pay respect to these supernatural beings, and the food is then in essence blessed and ready to give us better nutrients. The elders teach us that when we follow these laws, that the food will give you more nutrients and there will be more benefit to you if you are following these laws. So given the importance of the oceans and given the threats of the oceans, it really is important to achieve some kind of reconciliation. Oceans, as I've said, define Haida culture. They define our identity. We came out of the oceans. They define our laws. And so we are really inextricably linked to the marine spaces and to marine species. The amazing thing is that this connection has endured colonial and federal legislation and policies that has dispossessed us of our fisheries. My supervisor, Douglas Harris, has written about that dispossession that is really important to know about in BC and Canada's history. That dispossession tried to replace indigenous conceptions and management of marine species at law so that it could clear the way for the over-exploitation that we've seen, such as with the abalone and the herring spawn on kelp and the herring. Now, the greatest challenge to achieving reconciliation is the lack of recognition of indigenous title. This is an image that I've created to illustrate occupation in Canadian law. In Canadian law, we must prove that we have Aboriginal title to every square inch in order to get that recognition. And I've included in the back of the image, which you can barely see ghosted in this image, my husband's design called Occupied. And when he heard of this ridiculous idea that we have to prove occupation of every square inch, he created this image that completely filled the entire art piece. And yet he also turned it inside out, in that in Haida art and in all art, there's both positive and negative space. And your challenge as an artist is to balance the two so that your eye is drawn to certain things so that you can conceptualize the art. And so he turned it around so that he played with the mind so that the positive was negative and the negative was positive. And really it was, I understood it as this idea of the illusory myth of crown title to lands in British Columbia and Canada that have not yet achieved reconciliation, and how that myth is preventing recognition of Indigenous laws. I also use this as a study of the enduring nature of indigenous laws. If I didn't show you this ghosted in an image, you may not have known that it was there. And that is how indigenous laws are, in that we're just learning in the last decade or so about the presence and enduring nature of indigenous laws. Often we don't know what are indigenous laws and what relevance they have to the discussions and conferences like this. And so, but yet they're there, and they're there if you look for them, if your eye is trained to it, if you know what to look for, if you change your terminology from just values and ethics to laws, then you can see the indigenous laws that are always there, that are filling the entire space and that help guide us forward in our challenges of reconciliation in Canada. For marine spaces, which is what I'm focused on, that is the greatest challenge for recognition, because everyone has focused on terrestrial spaces. Even the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples doesn't mention marine tidal. Marine tidal has not been proven yet in Canada. It's an area that lags far, far behind terrestrial indigenous tidal. The other problem with marine spaces is that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea results in a fragmented oceans governance that makes it really hard to achieve the objectives of taking care of ocean species, because there are all these different components and they don't interconnect. Then it really becomes hard to actually achieve the goals of protecting marine species and marine spaces. I believe that there is an opportunity, drawing upon the Haida experience of terrestrial land use planning and marine spatial planning. It is the idea of enduring nationalism, could be called cooperative federalism, that scholars across Canada are looking at. And for the Haida, it is meant both jointly exercising title, both jointly exercising governance, each in their own realms, without recognizing the rights and title of the other. And so there are scholars who have looked at integration oceans governance and how that could help fragmented legal frameworks, especially because UNCLOS is so ill-equipped to manage increasingly threatened marine species. In fact, some of those scholars predict that integrated oceans governance is the future of UNCLOS. Other scholars have talked about how marine spatial planning can create boundaries of recognition, in that they create space for the exercise of jurisdiction and indigenous laws. So that is what the Haida has done with terrestrial planning, is that we are exercising our governance rights to 100% of the land base of Haida Gwaii, and starting to do that work in marine spaces as well. I talked earlier about the shorelines and the importance of them. We've protected 72% of the shorelines with these areas that are shown in dark blue, and also with the marine protected area that is part of Gwy. We've also are collaboratively managing Gwy Seamount, which is a supernatural being, an underground volcanic mountain, 180 kilometers off of Haida Gwaii. This is the marine planning subzone that is part of Haida Gwaii. The coastal First Nations have also been engaging in marine protected areas and network planning, and that's the second map that we've shown here, and have divided up the different zones. There are different overlapping systems of marine planning, but yet they are still advancing forward to achieve governance, the involvement of Indigenous peoples in governing ocean spaces. The incredible thing is that all of the two marine plans that we have negotiated with the government of British Columbia for conservancies and the governments of Canada for Gwy and Gwy Seamount have actually recognized Haida laws as what they call as ethics, but really they're laws and values that will guide their planning. These, for other Indigenous peoples who are on the call, these will be very familiar to you. They're sort of motherhood laws that are common to all Indigenous peoples, but yet they're hardwired into the marine plans, and they are the principles that the parties will operate under to ensure that these Haida laws are integrated into management of the marine protected areas. So they are respect, responsibility, interconnectedness, balance, seeking wise counsel, and reciprocity. Really, our need is to achieve peace and reconciliation with the oceans. John Burroughs has recently written about the need to achieve reconciliation with the land. It's not about it's not only about reconciliation of title, but it's about reconciliation with the land. In Haida Gwaii, it's about reconciliation with the oceans as well. It's really about finding a way to live together, to acknowledge that everything is interconnected, from the bears bringing the salmon into the forest to our respectful living in the landscape of Haida Gwaii. So just before, in the few minutes, I know I'm a little bit late here, so I only have a couple of slides left. I'll go pick up the pace here. The Haida Territorial Food System. I want to begin by talking about the Haida word for law. It shares the same root word as the word for respect, which is yakudang. The Haida word for law is kilt yakda. And the first word means voice or words or language. And to understand how voice and words and language is built into law, we need to turn to the institution of potlatch. Potlatches give voice to laws in ways that are respectful and truthful. It's more than just words. It's a practice of Haida law. It's a performance-based legal tradition that requires action. Those who potlatch and feast become yaqit. Those are high status people, and it's only possible if they're taking care of the people in the community. The Haida word for law incorporates ideas of right, truthful, appropriate, and respectful conduct. You become yaqit if you are taking care of the rest of the community through potlatches and feasts and other means. Whoops. So this is a sophisticated performance-based legal tradition. It validates our place in the world. It affirms our responsibilities to each other, to other peoples, and to place. Coastal food systems are embedded in potlatches and feasts, and they involve elaborate practices for gathering and distributing food to attain social status. This responsibility of caretaking spans generations, including ancestors and future generations. The interesting thing that I just discovered last week, working with the elders, is that the Haida word for responsibility is laguga kantlin, and it translates literally as you on it, chest leaning on. And I didn't know really what that meant until I realized that it is a reference to Kuya Gagandal, who is holding up Haida Gwaii. Kuya Gagandal has responsibility for the entirety of Haida Gwaii. And so when you are responsible, you feel it in the chest and in the heart. So the government of Canada outlawed potlatches from 1884 to 1951. I was speaking with Louise Mandel last week, and she is a mentor of mine, and she said that systems, she didn't say food systems, but systems with ancient roots do not have to be fixed, they need to be restored. So given the potlatch prohibition, this is what we need to focus on restoring, is this elaborate and beautiful food system that builds in respect and responsibility. The TRC, of course, has talked a lot about reconciliation and indigenous laws. We carry, each of us, on an individual and daily basis, the responsibility to achieve reconciliation. I think that we are, all of us, like Kuya Gagandal, in that we all have a responsibility to hold up the earth. We all have a responsibility to uphold the sea. I do want to end just with a quick video. And before I do so, I wanted to also come back to the word of law. As when I became a young lawyer, I asked the elders, what is the word for lawyer? And they told me the word for law, and they told me that the word for lawyer translates as someone who tells the truth. And then I thought, oh, wow, that's such a great thing for a lawyer, for all of you lawyers who are in this conference. But then in the next breath, they said, but it's so close to lying, to not telling the truth. So we're all walking that edge and finding the truth in the practice of law. So I'm just going to end now with a brief video that will show you a potlatch in action. This is a potlatch that my husband and I hosted in 2018 in Heidelberg, Alaska. Haida territory spans the international boundaries. And I think it's a great visual representation of what I've been speaking about today. that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I have great gratitude to all of you who are interested in this topic area. It is so important right now. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much, Terri-Lynn. We could all give a round of applause at this stage. If you could hear us, that would be great. But we can use our little virtual clappy hands. Thank you so much. We're going to invite questions at this point. There is a question in the Q&A already. By the way, if you have a question, don't use the raise hand feature. Put your question into the Q&A. It says Q&A at the bottom, and it has 2 speech bubbles on the icon rather than the single speech bubble of the chat. Terri-Lynn, I'll just raise the first question, and everyone else feel free to put some more questions in there. The question is why DFO consistently goes against evidence that fisheries should remain closed. What's the point of DFO when they don't listen to any of the evidence? And that's the extent of the question, but I would just add in there a twist, which would be, in your experience, what can help to bring DFO officials and ministers around to understanding that fisheries should remain closed if they're overexploited?
Well, I really can't speak for DFO and their reasoning. There often is a large lobbying by fishermen, by large fishing organizations to open fisheries, as was the case in Haida Gwaii in the herring fishery. And so that was why we initially reached out to negotiate a closure for them to stand down. But that is a big lobby. We also closed the sable fishery on Bowie Seamount through that collaborative management process. And that was a long and difficult and hard negotiation with the Sable Fishery Association to, once we had the evidence of hand about the impacts of the traps on the Bowie Seamount floor and the impacts on the fishery, only once we had that evidence were we able to go forward. In the Gwy experience, because we're engaged in litigation, we've looked at some of the early documents that the government of Canada created and circulated when they were considering entering into collaborative management with the Haida. Many of those documents expressed reluctance and fear about engaging in collaborative management with the Haida, and even the parallel approach of setting out our views about sovereignty and jurisdiction, but nonetheless kind of putting that aside and moving forward with management. They were worried about doing that. But the amazing thing is that we fast forward 30 years to the herring litigation, and it was their evidence that helped us to obtain that injunction. Their agreement that the fishery should be closed. That was the first time in 25 years that the Archipelago Management Board had actually reached a dispute that they couldn't resolve. The board operates by consensus. So, you know, that was a significant dispute, and their evidence was crucial to us meeting that. But the point is that they moved from resistance and fear and reluctance to completely being on our side about realizing the importance of herring, the precarious state of it, the need to rebuild it, and supporting our evidence in the injunction to constrain DFO. When we signed the marine agreement for Gwy, there were representatives from DFO who also joined the Archipelago Management Board. And it was those representatives that did not reach consensus with us about the need to keep the fishery closed. So I think there's great value, and there's other places in the world where people, this is about developing relationships, about understanding other worldviews, about developing the muscle of working together. And that experience of working together in Gwy really changed for Parks Canada, and I hope that there will be some impact on DFO. if they're willing to engage in collaborative management. It's a hard mandate to obtain. We've been working for many, many years to open up collaborative governance over ocean spaces, and there's a lot of resistance there.
I'll ask a follow-up. And then I see that there's another question, but just directly on that same point, can you share with us a little bit what was involved in getting the agreement to include this principle of respect for those Haida Law norms that you mentioned? What was involved in getting to that point, and how much farther and where do you think it still needs to go in order to achieve the sort of level of respect for Haida Law, the non-human peoples and the supernatural beings that are so central to Haida Law, to ensure that respect in the settler colonial legal system?
So the Haida engaged in the Haida Marine Traditional Knowledge Study, and then formed a Marine Planning Committee, and they worked with elders to articulate what the key Haida laws are. And they created a document that came out of that process called Towards a Marine Use Plan. So we set out and identified the laws, and then it was just a long, long process of negotiating agreement with the government of Canada. So we only just got the marine plan for Gwaii in place a few years ago, even though there has been this collaborative management regime in place since the 1980s. So that was part of it, was we weren't willing to agree to a plan that didn't include our laws. That we have to be part of that collaborative management as well. Now, I don't know if I've answered all your questions. There were a few wrapped up in there.
That's just great. And lo and behold, more questions are coming in now, so let us move to those. There's a question from Sarah Berger Richardson, who thanks you for the wonderful presentation. And she says, I can't help but compare the message of respect and reciprocity in relation to oceans with the message in the recent Netflix documentary Seaspiracy, which has generated a lot of controversy. I wonder if you could address the argument in the film that, quote, the best thing we can do for our oceans is to stop eating fish, end quote. Is there perhaps a more nuanced message that could be delivered based on the relationship that you described?
Well, first of all, I'm looking forward to seeing this film. I did not know about it, so I can't fully answer the question, but I mentioned about the elders who said if they could just have one more abalone, then they could die a happy person. But because they have actually foregone eating abalone, because that is the only way to uphold the laws of respect and responsibility, is to stop eating it. We have a responsibility to ensure that things prosper and grow. And that's supposed to be the job of DFO, but we're hoping that that will happen with the rest of the seafood. But I agree that the whole thing of balance is getting to that point where there is a point of no return. And we're getting so close to that point that we all have to be conscious and aware of that.
It's an amazing, sad situation to be in, given the environment of abundance that you described, isn't it? The next question is from Caitlin, who asks whether there are Indigenous representatives working with DFO.
I believe that there are. I know of at least 2 Haida people who work at DFO. I actually worked as a summer computer programming student at DFO 1 year. So, but everybody has a hope of changing and changing from the inside as well. I'm not aware of what the changes are, but I would imagine there are changes, difficult changes to make and hard and long fought.
There are 2 from Kathleen Gibson. Kathleen asks, well, she says, I've had the honor of spending time on Haida Gwaii. What is your impression of the usefulness of the Gwy Trust, which I think is operated with just over 50% Haida leadership? Does the Gwy Trust work with oceans? And she adds, thanks for explaining the energy on Rose Spit. She felt it, but didn't know where it was coming from.
Right, so actually the Gwy Trust is part of a paper that we released, I co-wrote with Dr. Sarah from Allard for the Canada Climate Law Initiative. So if you want to learn more about the Gwy Trust, I recommend you look at that paper. But it has been incredibly successful in creating, fostering community and relationships between Haida people and non-Haida people on Haida Gwaii. It is all about creating community and jointly doing so. And it is a large fund that funds community infrastructure and community projects and climate change projects. So I found it to be a very successful model. I don't know, it's a good question whether they funded ocean projects, and I will look at that, but I'm sure that it is. If they haven't, then it is coming up to be funded. They funded transitioning to clean energy, for an example, and others like that. That building of community through the Gwy Trust and collaboratively building island-wide consensus on forestry was really instrumental in getting the community of Port Clements to intervene on our side in the Haida case at the Supreme Court of Canada, that we think was really persuasive and powerful in the litigation. So Port Clements was the community that would have been most affected if Weyerhaeuser were to lose their rights to log. But they looked at whether British Columbia was taking care of their interests, or the Ministry of Forests, and realized, you know, I think we have greater trust that the Haida Nation will take care of our interests and foster community than the British government of British Columbia. And so they gave great testimony in the Haida case before the Supreme Court of Canada.
Speaking of the Supreme Court of Canada, there was a passage in your book, Out of Concealment, that really struck me, and I don't remember if it's in the segment on Cedar Sister or in your introduction, where you talk about speaking to the justices of the Supreme Court of Canada about Cedar being our sister for the Haida people. Can you say a little bit about what that was like, that experience?
Sure. The legal team went to Ottawa and spent time together finessing our oral submissions, and it got to a point where we weren't quite certain whether we would present that or not. I felt really strongly that it was important to present this conception of trees and forests, and how that should really, the whole argument in Out of Concealment and this idea of supernaturals is changing how we see the world and what we do to the world. So we felt it was important to forest management. I don't know, I mean, that view and other arguments that we've made in other litigation is not reflected in the court's decisions. So I don't know whether they hear it or not, but we just keep making those arguments. I didn't know that one of the judges nudged Chief Justice McLaughlin and said, do we really need to hear this? My submissions about the Cedar Sister, and apparently she just sort of shut it down and let me continue making those submissions. So I think that it's hard for people who are not raised in these traditions to really understand the relevance of that without connecting all of the dots. And when you only have a few minutes before the Supreme Court, it's difficult to portray all of that in an effective way. But I've often talked about that because I didn't know, because I was it was early in my career to make those submissions. I didn't know that it was a big deal to present at the Supreme Court of Canada. And it was really wonderful to have the Haida people attend the court, and also that all the courtrooms were full with university classes and others who wanted to hear, and other Indigenous nations across Canada. So that was really good for the elders to see and good for us as legal counsel.
Well, I would invite folks to put some more questions in the Q&A, and just as I said that, here's a question. This question is from Caitlin, Terri-Lynn, and it says, I've heard that marine protected areas are often ineffective at actually protecting oceans for a variety of reasons. Have you found that the marine protected areas are effective at protecting the ocean surrounding Haida Gwaii?
Yes, we have found that. We're still at the early stages of rolling it out, but as an example, Gwy Seamount is a marine protected area that we've entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Government of Canada, and as a result of rolling out the plan for the Gwy Seamount area, we have closed down the sable fishery in Gwy Seamount. We spent a long time negotiating the no-take zones and other zones within Gwaii, and it really was all of that marine planning that supported the herring injunction, the success of the herring injunction as well. I think the success for us is likely because of the long time period of working together that I think contributed to success, but also, as I mentioned, making sure that Haida laws are upfront and part of the foundational principles that guide the governance are really important. I don't know about the lack of success of other marine protected areas, but for us, it has been a successful tool in exercising our jurisdiction. But it's a great question.
Mm. And there's another.
Mm.
This question is from anonymous attendee, and it says, thank you for your wonderful presentation, Terri-Lynn. How do you see Haida marine laws being implemented in marine use and planning? Do the laws influence all levels of planning and negotiation with the Crown? Do planning policies and regulations need to meet a degree of consistency with Haida laws, and are they measured for this? How can these marine laws be more forcefully applied? Well, there's a lot in that question, so I leave it to you to decide which parts and how to answer.
Right, so those are all really great questions, and of course that's the challenge that we face now, is to have those laws rolled out and implemented to guide taking of resources from the marine areas. I believe that so far the laws have impacted the planning and negotiations with the Crown. It has meant, though, as I've said, it took a long time to reach agreement on the eventual plans, but we feel that the plans are much stronger and better because we took the time to ensure that they were embedded in the marine plans themselves. The difficulty that we have with that we haven't had in marine areas, but we have had in terrestrial areas, is the lack of consistency between Haida laws and Crown laws. So, for example, opening of approval of cutting permits or road permits in forested areas that the Haida didn't approve, but yet the Ministry of Forests approved. That made it challenging. It does get very hard to succeed in an injunction when you've protected, you're engaged in collaborative management over 100% of the land base and protected as solid protected areas, 25% of the land base. So it's almost like the weight of reconciliations makes it impossible to achieve an injunction in situations like that. So the next step beyond what we're doing in the terrestrial areas is to arrive at a single decision, to take the time that it needs to reach consensus. And that has been the reason for successes in the Gwy area, is that the management decisions are not pressing. They're management of a protected area. So there isn't a licensee who wants to get in and do this or do that, except of course in the herring fishery. And they can have the luxury of putting aside a difficult issue and coming back to it again and having another discussion and putting it aside and to keep revisiting it until they reach consensus. That hasn't been as successful in the terrestrial land base. While we might reach consensus on 90% of the proposed activities, it's the last 10% that are really important, and there are unilateral decisions made. So that is, of course, the Achilles heel of that collaborative management system right now that we need to work on developing and improving. It's early to see how the marine laws might be more forcefully applied. We intervened in the Enbridge Northern Gateway litigation and talked about the Herring decision and the judges finding that the Crown should be held to a higher duty, given the presence of these reconciliation agreements. The court didn't reflect that in the decisions. They just simply turned down the project on a basis of lack of consultation and accommodation. But that could have been an opportunity to see marine laws being more forcefully applied to things like shipping and navigation, where especially in the case of Haida Gwaii, where we have so much knowledge of the marine spaces and potential impacts, but yet there's a risk assessment being done that doesn't draw upon the rich body of evidence that we've developed for marine spaces.
The next question is from Nadia Lambeck, one of our conference organizers. She also thanks you for the wonderful presentation. And I'll just switch to the first person. It's easier to read the questions this way. By the way, Nadia wasn't able to post it in the chat because one of the disadvantages of being an organizer or host is you can't post questions in the chat. So in the Q&A, she had to post it in the chat to me. So I'll just read it from there. I find the idea that our food systems don't need to be transformed, but to be restored extremely powerful. It challenges us as food advocates to rethink where we're going and how to get there. It requires us to learn and respect indigenous law. It necessitates engagement with those connected to the land, and it challenges the constant narrative of innovation as necessary to fixing our broken food systems. Do you have any thoughts for us how we can make that switch, moving from transformation to restoration? And how might it change advocacy approaches towards ocean areas?
That is another great and big question. Thank you, Nadia. I don't know that I have the answer for it, but I guess I would say that the first step is for each of us individually to do that rethinking. It's sort of like how we rethink individually, take steps towards reducing and recycling and reusing. In the same way, we start taking smaller steps that ultimately end up in a very different place than you were than when you first started, for how you conceive of yourself in relation to food and marine species. As an example, attending a potlatch as an observer is a very different experience than actually participating in the potlatch and actually dancing a mask or participating in the ceremonies. I think that there is a great opportunity for ceremonies to recognize the life force in the food that we're taking and the need to do that conceptual shift again for thinking of a different way of managing food systems. And it's that ceremony and that sacredness that is often missed. And I'm sure that's what you've all been speaking about, but just going to a store and getting food that has lost its life is very different than taking food fresh or growing your own food fresh. It's completely a different taste and different feeling and different nutrition. And it's, anyway, I would encourage just taking small steps like that. So that I think could help with the transformation on an individual level. And then it's finding, restoring systems or ceremonies that work for you in your daily life or in your household or in your family or in your community, I think are important next steps from there. And that's as far as I can go. That very big question.
Thanks. And I noticed that Sarah Berger-Richardson was kind enough to put Nadia's question into the Q&A. So it's there now, and we've answered that. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the role of Potlatch in sort of performing Haida food law, if we can call it that. You mentioned that towards the end of your slides, and I just wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more, you know, without reaching limits on the knowledge you can share, but just elaborating somewhat on the interconnection between potlatch, food, you know, law and ceremony.
So I've also discovered that when a person marries, the word for married, actually tied into the word for married, is this idea that someone has married properly if they've married someone who will also value the institution of potlatch and will engage in potlatch. So the whole social structure is based on this idea of giving back to the community. And so I touched a bit about the status. The status is not gaining wealth for yourself, but gaining wealth to share with the community. And so when a person makes a decision to potlatch, they then, it's a long preparation period of gathering sufficient food to feed the community. They're often family members will harvest halibut or salmon or the prawns that you saw in the video for months and months to make sure that it's ready, or a couple of days for the potlatch, for the fresh food that is served. So it becomes, in the case of Heidelberg, when we have potlatches on Haida Gwaii, the host prepares the food, and the host clan, it's a collaborative effort of the whole clan to gather the food to feed the people. In Heidelberg, the potlatch that we did, another potlatch in Masset, and this potlatch in Heidelberg was the same in that we gifted each clan with a dance screen that they would use in potlatch, and it would give one of their main crests and their identity so that they would then be ready to potlatch. In Heidelberg, they have a different experience in Alaska in that many of the people were losing touch of even the names of their clans or their crests. And so they were so appreciative of receiving these dance screens that the whole community fed us. And so all that food was from every home in the community. They all contributed the food and we all shared jointly together. In potlatches, the potlatches begin by having ceremonies to feed our ancestors because we believe that they're with us in potlatch. And the fire is a conduit to feed our ancestors. And so that's a part, there are all these kinds of ceremonies that happen leading up to the potlatch and in the potlatch. So if it were not for food, there would be no potlatch. There would be no way to bring the community together to return back the wealth of the land in a potlatch system.
Thank you. I think we can take one or two more questions and then it's probably time to close. There's a question from Caitlin. Thank you for your questions, Caitlin. And it sounds simple on the surface, but it's potentially quite a complicated question. When you speak about the crown, are you talking about the actual queen/monarchy and their role in ocean protection? Or when you're speaking about the crown, are you instead alluding to the Canadian government?
Right. I am referring to the Canadian government in respect of marine spaces and the British Columbia government in respect of terrestrial areas or near shore and foreshore. And I didn't mean to say the crown, but it does sneak in because in litigation, we are suing Her Majesty the Queen as represented by the government of British Columbia or the government of Canada. In respect of marine spaces, it is the federal government and not the provincial government interestingly, we have entered into marine planning for Gwaii with the federal government, but the whole rest of the land base, we've entered into marine spatial planning with the government of British Columbia, who doesn't have jurisdiction over ocean spaces, because the federal government does not want to engage in spatial planning with us for the rest of the ocean spaces. And so that is why in the northern part of Haida Gwaii, it showed colored in the nearshore and foreshore areas, because that is the extent of BC's jurisdiction. So the next step is for BC Canada, the government of Canada, to join the marine planning process with the government of British Columbia, so that we are collaboratively managing the ocean spaces and not just the nearshore and foreshore. Our push in negotiations has been to do just that, to have Canada and British Columbia and the Haida at a single collaborative management board that would collaboratively manage all of the terrestrial spaces and the ocean spaces, and engage in a relationship building rather than a cede and surrender kind of model that is usually the mandate of governments in treaty negotiations.
Well, if you don't mind, I will take the prerogative of asking the last question. There isn't another question in the Q&A, and I apologize in advance if it's awfully abstract, but you've been speaking a lot about spaces, the marine spaces, the terrestrial spaces, and you've described the spatial approach where the, sort of the surface of the earth is sort of carved up into these sort of distinct zones or areas where particular entities have authority, or particular laws and policies are in effect. But the beautiful image you showed us of Haida Gwaii and the supernatural being on whose chest the pole and Haida Gwaii rest, they don't really correspond to a sort of a strictly spatial understanding of reality. So do you think there are limits to trying to, confine the approach to food governance or oceans governance to this sort of strict geospatial way of thinking about reality?
Yes, I do. The Gwaii Marine Plan is the first marine plan in the world to manage from mountaintop to seafloor, because we of course, that is interconnectedness is one of the main Haida laws. That is not the case from ocean top to seafloor in the rest of Haida Gwaii. And there are limits, especially that is the whole point about the legislative, the legal framework with UNCLOS, is that it is a fragmented ocean governance model. And so to some extent, we are drawing lines on a map and doing that. But there really isn't any other means to have a say over marine spaces than this, other than completing the title litigation or the negotiations, both of which we've been engaged in for over 20 years without yet producing something. So it provides a measure of control, and we're actually exercising our jurisdiction in respect of those bases. And while it isn't everything, it's a step along the way. It's an approach that the government of Canada has recently identified as their approach, and British Columbia has taken an incremental approach to treaty negotiations. So I guess it comes back to that earlier question. If there weren't enough salmon, or the last salmon, would you eat it? And we would say no. Our whole approach, the Haida whole approach, has been to put first and foremost protection, and then deal with jurisdiction. So this marine spatial planning is to deal with protection, to try to protect first so that we can then deal with jurisdiction later, and then deal with the interlinkages. The marine, the MAP process, which Coastal First Nations is engaging in, is involving some coordination among nations and among the British Columbia government. So that's a good step too. But for sure there are limits, because what is done in other parts of the ocean impact here. So it really is just taking the best available to us at the time to make sure that we're fulfilling our responsibilities to the extent we can.
Thank you. I would like, I'll just make a note here in the chat. Victoria has mentioned the lovely profile of Terri-Lynn that has been posted on the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy blog in the Meet Our Speakers blog series. And there are several other blog posts that delve a little bit more deeply into the background and the work of a number of our speakers. So thanks for posting that, Victoria. I also, before we close, I also noted quite early on, there was a question or a request in the chat about Terri-Lynn's slides. And I would just say that so there is going to be a recording of this session available on the conference website, and that will include all of the slides as Terri-Lynn showed them on her screen. So I think anyone who missed a few minutes will be able to see all of Terri-Lynn's slides that way. With that, I would just like to express our deep gratitude to Terri-Lynn for taking the time to share her knowledge, her experience and wisdom, and give us a little glimpse into the worldview for oceans governance that I think could be an inspiration for food governance and governance of all kinds everywhere. Thank you so much for taking that time. I know that we asked a lot of you, there was a lot of questions, and I really appreciate you having the energy and the willingness to be here with us.
Thank you very much, Professor Wood, and thank you to the students and Victoria for the great words and work and the volunteer work of everyone who's made this conference happen, and the honor of being introduced by the Dean. So thank you all, and best of luck with the conference. I'll look forward to looking at the recording as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, and thank you everybody for joining us from wherever you were joining us from, and we will close this session now. Thank you.